"You don't belong in this family, I." Those words came from my mother, and they cut through me like glass. I never thought my own family would make me feel like a stranger in the house I grew up in. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. Growing up, I was always different. My parents, Margaret and Neil, adored my younger sister, Lila. She could do no wrong. When she got into trouble, they called it a mistake. When I did something right, they called it luck. I worked 2 jobs in college while Lila got a new car for her birthday. I told myself they just showed love differently, but deep down, I knew I was never their favorite. When Dad's health began to fail, I came home to help. I cooked, cleaned, and took him to every appointment. For a short time, I hoped they'd finally see how much I cared. But during one family dinner, everything changed. My mother looked straight at me and said, "Ivy, we've decided to leave the house to Lila. You're too independent. You'll be fine on your own." I froze. The air left my lungs. Lila smiled across the table and said, "It's for the best. You've never really belonged here anyway." That night, I packed my bags and left without saying goodbye. I cried in the car the whole way to my apartment, wondering how a family could throw away one of their own so easily. Months later, I found out my parents sold the house to Lila and her fiancé, Nathan. They turned my childhood home into their dream place. Pictures of their renovations filled the family chat, the one I wasn't even in anymore. That was the moment I stopped being sad and started planning. A few weeks later, I drove past the neighborhood and saw something that made me stop. The house right next door to theirs was for sale. Without thinking twice, I bought it. I didn't tell anyone. The day I moved in, my mother stepped outside, pale and speechless. "What are you doing here?" she asked. I smiled, just settling into the neighborhood. From that day, I lived my best life next door. I made friends, helped neighbors, and kept my peace. Lila and Nathan's constant fights echoed through the walls, while I found happiness they could never touch. When Dad got sick again, I was the one who cared for him. Before he passed, he whispered, "We were wrong about you, Ivy. You've always belonged." I didn't need revenge after that. Living well right next door was enough. Margaret and Neil always treated my sister, Lila, like she was made of gold. She was the bright one, the favorite, the one who could never do wrong. I learned early that my efforts would never shine next to her. No matter what I achieved, Lila's smallest action earned more praise than anything I ever did. When I was in college, I worked long nights at a small diner and spent my days in class, struggling to make tuition payment. I never asked for help, but deep down, I wished they'd notice the effort. Instead, Mom would brag about how responsible Lila was for coming home early from parties. That was enough to get her a brand new car for staying out of trouble. I didn't even get a congratulations for graduating on time. Every phone call with my parents felt the same. They'd ask about my classes, then quickly turn the topic back to Lila, her plans, her friends, her dreams. Once, when I shared the news about my promotion, Mom smiled politely and said, "That's nice, Ivy. But did you hear Lila's thinking of starting a business?" It was like my achievements barely existed. Dad wasn't cruel, but he never stood up for me either. He'd laugh off my frustration and say, "You know how your mother is," as if that excused everything. I started visiting home less, knowing every trip meant watching Lila bask in admiration while I stood on the sideline. During holidays, the favoritism became impossible to ignore. My gifts were always practical: books, socks, or kitchen items. Lila's were expensive jewelry, designer bags, and vacations she deserved. I stopped pretending it didn't hurt. Each smile I forced felt heavier than the last. Once, when I saved enough to buy my own used car, Mom joked that it was cute compared to Lila's new one. I laughed along, but that moment stuck with me. It wasn't about the car, it was about how they saw me. To them, I was the independent one, the girl who didn't need anyone. But the truth was I did need them. I needed their approval just once. Lila enjoyed every bit of their attention. She'd toss her hair and say things like, "Ivy's the strong one. She doesn't care about this stuff." I'd smile through gritted teeth, pretending her words didn't sting. They all believed her, and maybe that was the worst part. The more they admired her, the smaller I felt. I became invisible in my own family's story, the shadow standing quietly behind the golden light that was my sister. And in that silence, resentment began to grow, slowly, quietly, but strong enough to change everything that came next. When my father's health started to fail, I didn't think twice about returning home. No matter how distant things had become, he was still my dad. I took time off work and moved back into my old room, determined to make things easier for him. I cooked his meals, helped him walk around the garden, and made sure he took his medicine on time. For the first time in years, the house felt almost peaceful. I thought maybe this was my chance to reconnect with my parents, to finally be part of the family again. At first, my mother seemed polite but distant. She thanked me for helping, though her voice always carried that sharp tone I remembered too well. Lila, on the other hand, appeared only when it was convenient. She'd show up with expensive coffee and sit beside Dad for a few photos, then rush off to meet friends. I didn't mind. I wasn't doing this for attention. I just wanted my father to feel loved and cared for. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, my mother suggested we all have dinner together. I took it as a good sign. Maybe she wanted to put things behind us. I helped set the table, cooked Dad's favorite soup, and even tried to make small talk. But the calm didn't last long. Halfway through the meal, she put down her spoon, looked directly at me, and said, "Ivy, your father and I have been talking. We've decided to leave the house to Lila. It doesn't feel right for you to live here anymore." The words hit like a slap. I stared at her, speechless, hoping I'd misheard. My father kept his eyes on his plate, silent. Then Lila leaned back in her chair with a smug smile and said, "Don't worry, Ivy. I can help you pack when the time comes." My chest tightened. Every memory tied to that house, birthdays, laughter, late-night talks with Dad, suddenly felt poisoned. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My mother went on eating, as if she hadn't just shattered what little bond we had left. After dinner, I walked to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. Everything I had done for them flashed before me. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the quiet hopes that maybe this time things would be different. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them see me break. That night, I packed my bags while the rest of the house slept. I paused by my father's door, listening to his weak breathing, then whispered goodbye. When I closed that front door behind me, I knew I was leaving more than a house. I was leaving a family that never truly wanted. A few weeks after I left, I tried to move on. I focused on work, kept busy, and told myself that distance would bring peace. But one morning, while scrolling through old messages, I saw something that made my stomach twist. My cousin had posted a picture in the family group chat. Lila and her fiancé, Nathan, standing in front of my parents' house, smiling wide with a sold sign beside them. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then more photos followed, shots of them painting the walls, tearing down the porch, replacing the garden I once helped my dad plant. My childhood home, the place filled with every memory I'd ever held close, was being stripped down by the same people who had pushed me out. It wasn't just a house to me. Every inch of it carried a piece of my life. The stairs where I'd sit waiting for my dad to come home. The kitchen where I learned to cook because Mom was too busy praising Lila. The backyard where I'd hide when I felt too small to exist inside. All of it was gone, sold off like it never mattered. I sat there, numb, scrolling through picture after picture. They were celebrating, their smiles glowing in every frame. Nathan had his arm around Lila, and my parents stood beside them, proud and cheerful. It was a family portrait, with no place for me. The group chat was full of congratulations from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years. "Such a beautiful new beginning," one comment read. Another said, "Lila deserves it. She's always been so responsible." My hands trembled. No one asked where I was. No one wondered how I felt seeing my childhood erased. It was as if I had never existed. I tried to close the app, but I couldn't. Each image pulled me deeper into the pain I'd been avoiding. Watching them tear down the place I once called home broke something inside me that couldn't be fixed. I didn't cry that night. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in silence, letting the betrayal settle deep, heavier than anger, colder than sadness. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about the message behind it, that I was replaceable, forgettable, a mistake they could scrub out of their perfect story. But as the bitterness grew, something else began to take root. I told myself I would never let them forget what they'd done. They wanted me gone, erased from their lives, but I would make sure they remembered who they cast out. That moment became the line I'd never cross back over. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be forgiveness. It would be the beginning of something they'd never expect. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I wasn't planning to drive down that road again, but something pulled me toward it. As I turned onto my old street, the memories came rushing back. The trees I used to climb, the cracked sidewalks I once raced across on my bike. I slowed the car when I reached my parents' house, now painted a brighter shade and surrounded by new flowers that Lila probably picked out. Then I saw it. A white sign planted in the yard of the house right next door, for sale. The letters caught the sunlight, almost daring me to look closer. I parked across the street, staring at the sign like it was some kind of invitation. My heart pounded as an idea formed in my mind, sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. Without giving myself time to overthink, I called the number on the sign. The agent answered cheerfully, describing the property as a lovely family home with great neighbors. I almost laughed at the irony. When she asked for my name, I hesitated for just a moment before giving it. She didn't know who my parents were, and they'd never suspect I was behind the purchase. Within days, I toured the place, signed the paperwork, and paid in full. No loan, no delay. When the sale went through, I didn't tell a soul. The house next to my parents belonged to me now. The keys felt heavy in my hand, a small symbol of control I hadn't felt in years. I didn't buy it out of rage. I bought it because it felt right. It was the one way I could face the past without running from it. The day I moved in, the air was still, almost too calm. The movers unloaded boxes while I stood in the driveway, pretending not to notice my parents watching from the porch. My mother's face went pale the moment she realized who I was. My father's shoulders stiffened, though he tried to act as if nothing was wrong. When she finally walked over, her voice shook. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her eyes darting toward Lila's windows next door. I smiled. "Just settling in. Looks like we'll be neighbors now." I didn't explain further. I didn't know them anything. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, listening to the faint sound of laughter coming from their side. I didn't feel bitterness, just calm, steady satisfaction. Each sunrise after that became part of my quiet revenge. I kept my yard neat, greeted neighbors kindly, and lived as if nothing between us had ever happened. They wanted me gone. Instead, I'd built my life right next door, close enough for them to see what peace looked like without their approval. The morning I started unpacking, the neighborhood was calm, birds scattered across the lawns, and the sound of a lawnmower buzzed in the distance. I was halfway through unloading boxes from the moving truck when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Ivy." I turned slowly. My mother stood at the edge of my driveway, frozen in place, her grocery bags hanging loosely from her hand. Her face drained of color, as if she'd seen a ghost. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind. Finally, she managed to whisper, "What are you doing here?" I gave her a calm smile, one that didn't reveal a thing. "Just settling into the neighborhood," I said lightly, stacking another box on the porch. "Looks like we're neighbors now." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She stood there, still as stone, trying to understand what she was seeing. I could almost hear her thoughts. How could the daughter she pushed away end up living right next door? A few minutes later, my father appeared at the front of their house. He had that practiced smile he used whenever he wanted to hide discomfort. "Ivy," he said, forcing cheer into his voice. "What a surprise. You didn't tell us you were moving here." "Didn't think it would matter," I replied softly. He gave a small laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Well, it's nice to have you back in the area." His eyes darted toward my mother, who still hadn't moved. Her posture was tight, her jaw clenched. I could sense the confusion, the guilt, maybe even the fear, creeping beneath her calm mask. They weren't just surprised, they were unsettled. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes. The curtains in their front windows stayed closed more often. When I watered my plants, my mother would suddenly remember she had something to do inside. My father tried to keep up appearances, offering short greetings, but every word carried strain. The friendliness they showed the neighbors never reached me. One evening, I caught my mother watching me through her blinds as I carried in groceries. When our eyes met, she quickly turned away. I didn't wave or speak. I didn't need to. My silence said more than any words could. The tension thickened each day. Every polite smile they forced, every nervous glance they exchanged, revealed the truth. They couldn't escape what they'd done. I hadn't shouted or accused them. I'd simply existed right next door. That alone was enough to haunt them. Living there wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. They had once told me I didn't belong, but now they had to see me, every single day, standing exactly where they never wanted me. I didn't plan to make a scene. I just wanted to live quietly. But things have a way of unfolding when you least expect them. After settling into my new home, I began meeting the people around me. Most of them had known my parents for years, and their surprise at seeing me there slowly turned into warmth. I offered help where I could, fixing small things, dropping off meals, taking time to listen. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to feel like a place where I truly belonged. When Mrs. Green down the street slipped on her porch, I brought her soup and helped her with groceries until she healed. When a group of kids needed a hand with homework after school, I opened my porch to them and started tutoring every week. Before long, my driveway filled with laughter and bicycles every afternoon. I hadn't realized how much I missed the feeling of being part of something real. People began stopping by just to chat. They'd wave when they passed and bring over pies or flowers as thanks. Every small act of kindness grew into something larger, something my parents couldn't ignore. I saw my mother watching from behind her curtain while I set up tables for a small cookout one Saturday. Neighbors brought food, shared stories, and laughed into the evening. The same laughter that once filled her yard now came from mine. Word spread fast. I became the one everyone turned to when they needed advice or help. My name came up in every neighborhood conversation, always with respect. And that's when Lila started showing up again. She'd wander over with forced smiles, trying to blend into the gathering. But it was obvious. Her charm didn't work here. People admired kindness, not appearances. Nathan, her fiancé, looked uneasy every time he saw me chatting easily with others. He'd make small talk but avoided eye contact for long. I could feel the tension between them. Lila wanted the spotlight, the praise, the admiration. Yet no one looked her way anymore. It was subtle, but I noticed the cracks forming in her perfect act. At night, I could hear their arguments drift through the quiet street. My mother would pace the porch, pretending to water plants that didn't need it. My father's greetings became shorter each time he saw me. They were polite, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. I didn't need to gloat or say anything cruel. Their discomfort was enough. Every moment they saw how well I fit into the world they tried to keep me from was its own quiet victory. I hadn't taken anything from them. They had simply lost what they thought they owned. The same neighbors who once favored their daughter now stood beside me, seeing me for who I truly was. I didn't plan revenge. I just lived differently, and that was enough to undo them. The peace I found in my new home seemed to unsettle the world next door. I never said anything about my family, never mentioned the past, but people noticed things on their own. Whispers began to move through the neighborhood, soft, curious, impossible to stop. Lila and Nathan's house had turned into a construction zone. Every few weeks, a new crew arrived. First, it was the kitchen, then the roof, then the landscaping. Expensive cars came and went, but progress never seemed to stick. Someone mentioned that the couple had borrowed heavily, and payments were falling behind. I didn't ask questions, but stories always found their way to me. Neighbors started comparing our houses. Mine was simple but cared for. Theirs looked grand yet incomplete. When someone praised my garden or the warm feeling of my porch, I'd see Lila's curtains twitch. It was the smallest glimpse, but I knew she was watching. Nathan had stopped waving altogether. He looked exhausted, as if life inside that perfect home was wearing him down. I stayed out of their affairs. I greeted them when we crossed paths, nothing more. But as months passed, their smiles faded, their voices grew tense. The laughter that once came from their backyard disappeared. It was replaced by silence and the occasional slammed door. I could hear it from my kitchen some nights, and every time, I reminded myself not to feel pity. They had chosen this path. Then one evening, as the sun began to set, I heard soft footsteps on my porch. When I opened the door, my mother stood there. She looked older than I remembered, her eyes red and swollen. She didn't speak at first. She just stared at me, as if she couldn't believe I was real. "Ivy," she finally whispered, her voice trembling, "why are you doing this to us?" Her question stunned me. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't spoken ill of them, hadn't interfered in their lives. I had simply existed beside them. But in her mind, my peace had become their punishment. I took a deep breath and stepped outside. The fading light painted her face in soft shadows. "I'm not doing anything," I said quietly. "I'm just living my life next door." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't respond. She turned and walked back to her house, shoulders heavy, moving as if the weight of her choices had finally settled on her. I watched her go, feeling no victory, just a calm understanding. Sometimes revenge doesn't come through action or anger. Sometimes it's the reflection people see when they face what they tried to destroy. I hadn't sought to ruin them. I had only shown them what peace looks like when it belongs to the person they once cast away. Time moved quietly after that evening. The tension between our houses faded into a heavy stillness. The neighborhood grew used to our strange closeness. Two homes side by side, divided by silence. I kept to my routine, caring for my garden, helping the neighbors, and living peacefully. But one morning, I noticed something that pulled me back into the world I had tried to forget. My father's car hadn't moved for weeks. The curtains in their living room stayed drawn, and the lights were rarely on. I heard from Mrs. Green that he had fallen ill again, weaker than before. Lila was nowhere to be seen. She had taken on a new job out of town, though everyone whispered that she rarely called. My mother was trying to manage things alone, but her tired face told the story before she ever opened her mouth. I tried to ignore it, but each day, as I watched their house grow quieter, the old instinct returned. I remembered how it felt to care for him, to make sure he ate, to keep him comfortable. Finally, one evening, I cooked a pot of soup and carried it over. My mother looked surprised when she opened the door. For a second, she didn't move, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to accept my kindness. "I just thought you both might need this," I said, placing the container in her hands. She nodded without speaking, her eyes glistening. I turned to leave, but a weak voice called my name from inside. "Ivy," my father said. I stepped into the dim hallway. He was sitting in his chair, frail and pale, but his eyes were steady. It had been months since we'd truly spoken. I sat beside him in silence until he finally said, "You didn't have to come." "I know," I replied softly, "but I wanted to." He looked down at his trembling hands, his voice barely a whisper. "We were wrong about you. I see that now." For a moment, the room felt still. His words carried the weight of everything left unsaid, the years of distance, the things they'd chosen to ignore. I didn't cry. I just nodded, letting the truth of his regret settle between us. He reached out, his hand resting on mine. "You've always belonged," he said. Those words shouldn't have meant much after everything that happened, but somehow, they eased a pain I didn't realize I still carried. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. That night, when I returned home, I stood on my porch and looked at their house. The lights inside flickered softly through the windows. For the first time, I didn't feel anger when I saw it. I felt something gentler, an understanding that revenge had lost its place. What remained was something far more human, closure. When the call came that my father had passed, a strange calm settled over me. The house next door had been quiet for months, its owners rarely seen. Lila had taken a job across the state, and my mother had retreated into routines that no longer included me. There was no celebration, no drama, just the slow, hollow passage of life moving on. I stayed. I didn't pack up or leave. The streets were familiar, the trees casting long shadows over my porch in the late afternoon. I found comfort in the ordinary, tending to my garden, watering the flowers, trimming the hedges, and watching the sunlight play across the lawn. Each plant seemed to thrive more than the last, a reflection of the life I had built for myself, steady, deliberate, untouchable. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, dropping a pie or offering a wave. They spoke kindly, telling stories about my father, sharing memories I hadn't known, and it struck me that I had become part of a new chapter in their lives. It wasn't about them praising me. It was about being present in a way my parents had never acknowledged. From the window of my house, I could see my mother occasionally, her presence shrinking like a shadow at the edge of my world. Lila's visits were sparse, and when she did appear, it was fleeting, hesitant, polite, but clearly uncomfortable. Their once proud gestures of ownership and superiority had faded, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of my existence that they couldn't erase. I didn't flaunt my life or gloat. I didn't send messages or remind them of what they had lost. I simply lived, and every day, the proof of my independence, resilience, and happiness stood in full view. My garden blossomed, my home was warm, and the air carried laughter and the hum of normal life. That alone was enough. Occasionally, I would glance at their house. The paint seemed duller than I remembered. Windows that once reflected pride now held only fatigue. I didn't need to gloat. They could see me, thriving, calm, unbothered. The house that had rejected me was now a daily reminder of what they had lost, a silent witness to the life I had built despite them. Over time, I realized this was the sweetest victory. Not confrontation, not anger, not revenge through words. It was the quiet assertion of my place in the world. I had been cast out, dismissed, and overlooked, yet I endured. I stayed, I grew, and I flourished. And every morning, when the sun spilled across my porch and the flowers swayed gently in the breeze, I knew I had won. Not by undoing them, but by living well, fully, and without apology, right next door. Do you think I did the right thing by leaving my family and building a life next door? Or should I have tried to forgive them? I'm really curious about your thoughts. Share in the comments below.